All right, what'd you miss? Theresa May cleared out many of her predecessor's senior team as she took the helm as UK's Prime Minister. Among her first action, May fired George Osborne and replaced him with Philip Hammond, the former Foreign Secretary. London Mayor Boris Johnson was named Foreign Secretary. David Davis was assigned the task of overseeing Brexit negotiations. Joining us now to discuss the team overhaul is Nina Schick. She's Director of Communications at EU policy think tank Open Europe. Nina, first question. I remember right after some pundits out there say, we're not really sure that triggering Article 50 is actually ever going to happen. Now that the new government is essentially totally in place, isn't that anymore? Theresa May has said Brexit means Brexit. Is it pretty clear this is going to happen?
There's no ambiguity at all, and anything otherwise is simply wistful thinking. And I think that was always going to be the case, no matter who was the Prime Minister, because you simply cannot ignore a referendum like this when you've said that this is the will of the people, whatever way it goes. And the only uncertainty now is when is that actually going to be triggered, because, of course, the ball right now is in the UK's court. It's only the UK who has the right to trigger Article 50. And once you do that, then the clock starts ticking. Then you have a 2-year period to start negotiating. So essentially you're handing over power to the rest of the EU. And what Theresa May is doing now is obviously being very smart and putting together her team and also trying to find out what kind of relationship do we actually want to have with the EU. And the indication seems to be, given that none of the models outside of the EU, I'm talking about Norway and Switzerland, work for the UK, because those countries have to accept free movement of people and make a significant EU budget contribution. I think we might be moving towards an entirely new model, which is based on an FTA, rather similar to the deal that Canada negotiates with the EU.
Nina, obviously U.S. money managers here that we've been speaking with on the stock team are very focused on what's happening in England. But when I talked about the cabinet choices, a lot of them don't really know who these people are. So as Theresa May continues to build out and make these choices, should portfolio managers and money managers here be paying attention? Is there going to be certain outcomes based on who's chosen, or has Theresa May just lined up the path and we don't have to worry about the individual names that come here?
No, I think we do have to worry, or we have to take note, certainly. And I think the most interesting thing is that those who are charged with negotiating Brexit are all leading Brexit MPs. Boris Johnson, David Davis, but to some extent they might be window dressing, and we might see Theresa May and Philip Hammond actually playing a bigger role in the negotiations. And I think that's certainly true for Boris Johnson, given that his appointment as the Foreign Secretary went down not very well across the EU. But I think watch David Davis, certainly. He, of course, used to be the candidate to be the Conservative leader, and he was taken out of power by David Cameron. So he's been a backbencher for a very long time, and now he's making his return. It's also worth noting that Theresa May, when she was standing outside the stairs of Downing Street, she made a very kind of almost left-leaning speech about future policies on the economy, but now we have a very far-right government, so it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out in practice once the cabinet is actually in place and things start kicking off here.
And of course, her tagline is not just for the privileged few, and she's talking about putting labor leaders on corporate boards, something that's probably not going to go down very well at all with her constituency, especially those in Parliament. But she did say that she's going to trigger Article 50 around Christmas time or the beginning of next year. Initially, Nina, EU leaders were very angry and wanted her to do it, or wanted the UK to trigger Article 50 immediately. Now they seem to have softened up a little bit. You heard Angela Merkel a few days later saying, okay, let them take their time about it. Do you think the longer they wait, the better the conditions are that they'll get in negotiations?
Well, let's not forget that the EU isn't a single entity, and there's very many different opinions as to how this should proceed. And we've heard lots of tough talk from the European institutions, the European Parliament, and certainly France. And I think that the longer the UK waits, it's not going to become more favourable for them, because let's remember, for the rest of the EU, they don't want to spend the next 5 to 6 years discussing the terms of Britain's exit from the EU. They certainly have enough going on within the Eurozone and in the remainder of the EU. And I think Merkel, of course, she's a pragmatist. She's always a pragmatist. But Britain has made the mistake during David Cameron's renegotiation and reform of the EU of relying far too heavily on Merkel. And I'm afraid that that is the mistake that may be made again now. Because let's be clear, the EU certainly doesn't want to give the UK a better deal than what it had inside, because that is a threat to the EU, an existential threat to the EU itself at a time when populism is on the rise and you have all these far-right parties calling for their own referenda. So we are going to be entering a very, very tough negotiation, and I think Britain has to be under no illusions about how difficult it's going to be going forward.
Real quickly, you mentioned that in Theresa May's speech, she sounded some left-leaning notes. I also noticed some similar left tones from Michael Gove in his speech, where he talked about curbing some of the excesses of capitalism. Is this something that's sort of going through the political elite on the right, where, yes, it's conservative, but people are starting to have maybe got sent a message by the referendum that there needs to be some fundamental changes to the economic model?
Tremendously. And I mean, if you look at those people who actually swung the referendum to Brexit, these were people who don't usually vote in general elections because they feel the political system doesn't work for them. They feel left behind. They feel that globalization has changed their pace of life and somehow that nothing is getting better for them. So it would be political suicide for the next Prime Minister not to take note of that. But it will be also very interesting to see how that dynamic between the liberal leavers, you know, those who wanted to leave because they wanted Britain to seize the opportunities that are available to them in the world, including, you know, striking free trade deals, less of a state. How do they reconcile that with the very large majority of people who voted to leave because they wanted a more protectionist, closed-down Britain? And that's something I think domestically that's going to be very interesting, and we don't know how that's going to fall in the end.
All right, very interesting stuff. Thanks a lot. That's Nina Schick, Director of Communications at Open Europe.